And it was actually a study on future prospects of social innovation in education. And I am focusing here on one aspect, which I call the transformative potential of social innovation in, for, and by education, because I think that you cannot just talk about social innovation in education. That would just be too narrow. And I did this study together with my colleagues from the Austrian Institute of Technology, sorry, Doris Schartinger and Karl-Heinz Leitner. And there were also some colleagues involved from the Austrian Institute of Advanced Studies. This is why you see both of our logos here. Okay, I think okay. The aim of the study was to assess the future potential of social innovation in education in terms of what innovations can do for education, and also to advise policymakers how to use social innovation in a better designed education policy, and for this using scenario techniques, and to give some input for the European 2020 strategy and the future of learning agenda. As I mentioned before, it is interesting to take a closer look on the definition of social innovation for, in, and by education. And this was not really called for in this study, but we wanted to do this in order to shed light on the fact that there is not really a big community, academic community, doing much research on this topic, but that it has definitely a big potential, especially when you connect to some of the social innovation projects that have been going on and funded by the European Commission over the last 5 years. So we have a threefold definition here, which is social innovation for education, in education, and by education. And the first one is in the blue box. This is social innovation for a better quality of education. And then in the gray box, we have social innovation within the educational sector. And in the green box, we have as an output the new education system for social innovation and the contribution of the education system for social transformation, which means that the education institutions and education actors connect more to their environment and to their communities. And before I go to the red box, I would shed light on the gray box again and mention that we took a broader approach to the education sector. So of course there is the traditional education sector included with schools, universities, and so on, but we also included all kinds of education levels, because we think that education goes on all your life and it does not stop after school or university education, and it does not stop after formative education. So there are a lot of things going on at work, for example, in the industry, and people who work have to train their skills on the job. And often this is very different from what you had at your original education for the job. And then, of course, you have a personal education at the micro level, the individual who is educating herself or himself all the time, even though you might not be aware of this. And it's also important to provide to each individual the possibility for their own education. And this leads us to the red box with the definition of social innovation should actually be in, for, and by education, and that includes responding to pressing social needs and creating new social relationships or collaborations, and includes innovations that are social in both their ends and their means. So, and with this, I want to show one slide on our foresight approach, because this was basically a foresight study, but I'm not going to explain much more about the methodology. So first, we did a horizon scanning on trends and drivers and wildcards, and so that affects social innovation in education, or also education apart from social innovation. And then we had a stakeholder survey, and after that an interactive workshop with participants from the education, foresight, and social innovation sector to develop some scenarios. And we ended in 3 scenarios. One was on the knowledge society, one on economization of education, and one on digitalization of education. And this resulted in a final report on the future of social innovation and education. And the time frame for this was 2030. So there were some key challenges for social innovation in education from our horizon scanning that I want to share with you. So for example, that the traditional education system and education policies do not fit in response to present and societal challenges for various reasons. And there are many new forms of learning around today. There are new groups, constellations for learning, and you also have new stages of life that require learning. Today, we are faced with much shorter time periods to acquire necessary skills, and also in the future. And learning becomes more often a community-based process involving social innovation. And from our horizon scanning, we divided 14 key aspects into a STEEP category, which you might be familiar with if you've done foresight before. So we had these categories: technology, economy, education, policy, society, and values. But for time reason, I will not go into these in much detail, but these 14 were the key issues that we had asked the respondents in the survey to assess what were the critical uncertainties for these developments. We had about 160 respondents, but I will not go into their background at the moment. I can do this maybe in the discussion, but what I would like to highlight is the 4 key critical trends and drivers they thought need more attention for a time horizon until 2030. And these are the extension of classroom-based projects for social engagement. Second, the development of partnerships to extend the classroom to the community. And third, the promotion of creative thinking in secondary and tertiary education. And finally, increasing empowerment of civil society. Also interesting here might be the ranking of what are the barriers for hindering the inclusion of social innovation within the education sectors. And here they were asked to rank the 5 top factors. So the first one is actually the main barrier they identified is the culture within the education institution. And second is the lack of support from policy. Lack of flexibility due to regulation is the third. And the fourth is lack of support from management in education institutions. And the fifth would be lack of awareness of societal challenges. So all the others were not ranked with so much significance as, for example, lack of skills of teachers, was only on the sixth position, or a lack of motivation from teachers does not seem to be such a big problem. And there seems to be also enough demand from society, and assessment of performance or assessment of procedures were not ranked as significant barriers, and also motivation from learners was on the lowest of these factors. So after the survey, we assessed the critical uncertainties for the scenario building, and identified 3 scenarios for the future of social innovation in education. And the first one is learning intensive society. The second one is a dichotomy of education systems in a polarized world. And the third one is the information industrial complex. So I'll very briefly spend the rest of the time now to go very quickly through these scenarios. So the knowledge intensive society is the positive scenarios, and this is a society that has decided that it is not important how much you contribute to economic growth or to the accumulation of material wealth. What's really significant for this society is the production, and especially the sharing of knowledge. So every individual has the right to education, and policies are oriented towards the achievement of this, societal development goals, and also to direct learning practices towards their achievement. Also, the social welfare economy is very important here, and especially the participation of everybody in this process. And life is not organized for work anymore, but work is organized for life, even though it might not always be remunerated. And people work and operate less in hierarchies, but in networked autonomy. And education institutions are characterized as open, flexible, and permeable. People are committed to provide the skills and means for solving societal problems with and within the community. Okay, this is a brief account of this knowledge-intensive society. And then we have the dichotomy of the education system in a polarized world, which basically depicts an economization of education. So it means especially privatization of education, so that there are very advanced schools and universities around, but also training institutions for professionals, but they are all private, so you have to pay for it, or you have to have an employer who pays for it. So this is available only for the well-to-do, and the others fall into the category of a public education, which does not provide high quality. So this widens the social gap in society, of course. And it might also increase shortage of qualified labor and endangering economic growth in the end. In terms of social innovation, there might be initiatives from well-to-do people, from philanthropies, from some companies, and from cities, but probably not sufficient to cope with the bulk of social problems. And then finally, we have the information industrial complex, which is which is a scenario that depicts a society where big data and IT are the driver, and where especially companies, big multinational companies that provide information tools and collect data, they are the providers also of education institutions, so that they fund schools, they take care that schools are fully digitalized, that children learn from early on how to handle these technologies, how to be innovative within the frame of these technologies, and how to develop technologies even further. But there's little room for creativity, for social sciences, the arts, and so on. So the STEM subjects in school are very much promoted, and also who gets access to which education program, how people are evaluated in their studies at work, and so on, or even scientists with their publications. This is all subject to algorithms and not to people or institutions anymore. And yeah, there might be room for social innovation, of course, also in this society, but they are very much tied to information technologies. So they are done either through information technologies, or they are education programs to bring people closer to innovation technologies. And I have one slide left for some examples that are already around on social innovation projects in the education sector. But I'm not sure if we have enough time or if we should go further on to the next. Oh no, sorry. Before that, I have some policy recommendations. Sorry. I mean, the paper is full of policy recommendations, but I chose 5 maybe for discussion here that I find crucial. So I will go through them briefly. So the first is that education institutions need to take an active role in society in order to encounter the rising inequalities in the European society. So here education institutions are very important and have a social responsibility. And with the larger societal challenges we are presently facing, and also facing in the future, a broader understanding of education in conjunction with social innovation is a precondition for the mutual understanding of conflicts and differences and feasible mechanisms to solve them, as we can especially see now when we open the news. And education in the context of social innovation has to be understood as enabling people to achieve the capabilities they need to take part in our society at all levels. And the extension of the classroom-based project means to make socially relevant topics with real-life challenges part of the curriculum. And new policies need to support the building of broad ecosystems for social innovation based on networks integrating the various actors and stakeholders engaged in education. So this would be the final slide, and in the discussion I can show also a slide with examples if this is wished. Okay, here I stop. I hope I kept the time frame.
You did very well, thank you, Suzanne, and it's very interesting. I think now we have a response from Klaus, please. So we'll stop sharing the screen, please, Suzanne. Hi, Klaus, you're on.
Hi, thank you very much. First of all, Susanne, thanks a lot for this interesting foresight exercise, which I liked very much. Thanks especially for having the focus in your presentation now on the results. Of course, I had the full paper, so my feedback is now on the full paper. And I divided in 3, so to say, pillars. The first one is this focus on the definition of social innovation, where you spend a lot of pages actually on this focus in the paper. Then I have some observations, and at the end, probably 1 or 2 questions. So if you allow me, first with this focus on the definition of social innovation. As mentioned before, you put a lot of attention on the derivation of how to define social innovation. I found this interesting because your focus actually, but correct me if I'm wrong then, is more on enabling factors for social innovation in education. So to say, it's more on the ecosystems approach than less on specific social innovation. That's why I wonder why you put so much effort on the definition of social innovation when your approach is more on these enabling factors. You had different sources of social innovation, I think very well organized, with very important points raised, like that most of the social innovation proclaim to do something good for society, which I believe is not enough of, and not the only one who believe it's not enough for a definition for social innovation. It's a little bit naive as well, because also Nestle does good for society, at least that's the self-perception. And of course, also social actions and social innovations are results of social actions, always have some negative implications for some actors, stakeholders, groups, and individuals. That's clear. You also have this focus on saying that new services are important, but it's problematic because sometimes it's about enabling new processes that probably are followed up by new services. And whatever, I come to the point, my favorite definition, which you didn't mention, but you know it, and it would also be interesting to know why you didn't mention it, is the ESSA-Drive definition, which most of those listening in this session know, of course. I read it very quickly. It's defined as a social innovation, defined as a new combination or figuration of practices in areas of social action, prompted by certain actors or constellations of actors, with the goal of better coping with needs and problems than is possible by using existing practices, and innovations therefore social to the extent that it varies social action and is socially accepted and diffused in society. This means, in other words, that a social innovation has to be intentional, and if it's not intentional, or we cannot attribute so to say, the innovation to certain agents, or if the agent's landscape is very blurred and unclear, then it's more about social change than social innovation. And this leads me also to your example that you mentioned very often, that Fridays for Future is an example for social innovation. And I agree that Greta Thunberg is definitely an agent, and also that Fridays for Future became a social movement with a clear intention and purpose. But at least for me, it was not clear by now that they really do social innovations, or they promote social innovations. What they do is advocacy work. You mentioned now that out from these movements, there are also self-learning classes organized on climate change by the pupils or students together with the parents. If such things occur, then I fully agree that also this movement produces already social innovation. This was new to me. For me, this was more an advocacy work because I did not see, so to say, the social innovation. So it's important to provide solutions. And that's the main property also of a social, one of the main properties of a social innovation. So we have intention, we have solution, and of course there are also additional other properties. And of course, a social innovation has to work in the arena of social actions, like in the school system, and follow, so to say, a social purpose, like public education. And we also know that it has to be more than just a brilliant idea. It has to be accepted and diffused in society, or at least in certain subsectors of society. So having said this, I come to the observation. So you reference some policy documents in your paper and policy approaches also to show the urgency of your study, I assume, which I understand, which I think is good. But it was interesting for me to see these documents which you mentioned. They are very purpose-oriented at the European level. So meaning they have a focus, a directionality towards this economic approach the one which you then had in the scenario 2, which is more, which you called probably the least preferable one, but the ongoing one. So all these policy documents were also flavored by this new public management thoughts, and little or not emancipatory at all. I found this interesting, as an interesting observation. Obviously, this is the mainstream in which we work, and also your foresight exercise is probably anchored in. You also differentiate between 3 levels of social innovation in the education system, for the education system, and produced by the education system. So it means input to help the education institutions to become more socially innovative. Then social innovations emerging from education institutions to address specific social needs. And then education institutions as loci for social innovation. And I wonder, are these 3 dimensions already realized? Importantly, however, I think it's a very good systematization and a good starting point for foresight. Also, I think the differentiation between social innovation in the education system and by the education system is difficult to grasp. It also might be a little bit blurred. Maybe you have also a comment on that. And then you postulate, very short now, 2 bullet points. First, you said there are no communities of practices for social innovation for the education, in the education, and by the education system or sector. And of course, this is a very sober statement. Probably you're right. I'm not an expert in this field. But if it's really like this, then we really have a serious shortcoming if we don't have communities of practices. And I think this would be also an important area of intervention for building a broad education ecosystem. So we have to somehow nurture and raise these practices for social innovation in the education system. Small comment, you also mentioned the foci schools, which started out of the worker education councils, and you postulate that they are originating from within the education system. I doubt this. I think they are, on the contrary, they were established in parallel to the formal education system. Finally, a word on the foresight. I think the foresight approach is very robust and solid, a nice process. The like, of course, that you have this focus on trends and drivers which are uncertain, but at the same time potentially impactful, and that they shape, so to say, the scenarios which you developed. Excellent. And in that case, this third scenario, which you labeled the information industrial complex, is especially relevant now in times of the COVID-19 crisis, because it was about the digitalization of education. And I think this could be also a trigger. So I also have a few questions, but I will just pose one question, if you allow me, namely, and that's a main question which we can address probably to most of all foresight exercises. What is actually now the use of this exercise? How does it come into use? How do you approach the politicians with it? Where is the 5 minutes? I hope so.
Yeah, more than.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So, Suzanne, you might want to take Klaus's first question there, and then perhaps we'll have one question from the audience.
Can I, if we may, just to save some time, because we're a bit delayed. Suzanne, do you want me also to read you the questions from this chat so that you take notes and answer them all together?
Okay.
Sure.
Okay.
I will try, okay?
Yes. Okay. So there are 3 questions. So the first one is, what can the education system achieve on its own to tackle inequalities? This is from Attila. One from Ponopel. Could the introduction of social innovation policies premised on instrumentalist mechanistic ideas that it solves problems and is inherently good hollow out education systems and the role therein of social science and humanities? And the last one, do you have any ideas about how to deal with conflicts in the process of becoming more social activist in education?
Okay. Well, those are really
I know it's not fair, but if you can be as short as possible.
But first of all, thanks to Klaus, I think it's quite a luxury to have such an elaborated comment. And yeah, I will not go into detail with all your observations, which are of course all right. And I think when I consider them, revising my paper, it will become much more solid, and I will take them all into consideration. And maybe for the background of the project, I have to say that the European Commission probably expected much more input from us, or much more output on the digitalization measures, or much more appreciation of digitalization. But from our research and consultation with experts, we found that this was an important aspect, but could not be the focus of the study. And that it is more important really to focus on the people and on the institutions rather than on digitalizations. So, and this is also maybe why this economic factor was considered in the study, but just shifted a little bit then maybe to a marginal position, especially when you consider social innovation as part of the education system. So what is the use of the exercise is a very important question, of course. I can tell you that there were also 3 other studies commissioned along with our study. One other that we also conducted was on the future of informal and non-formal learning, which complements very well our study on social innovation. And then there was also one on new assessments of education. And together with these 3 other studies, the DG on education is opening a new online platform, I believe, which puts the studies and the results on a public debate, and apparently wants to use these as inputs for future research projects and in the next framework program, and of course on a discussion more among teachers. I think there is now an annual conference or summit even of teachers organized by the European Commission, and they focus on different topics each year, and these studies are supposed to be considered in these summits. Now, how much they really influence the policy making, especially since education, of course, is more a national policy, I cannot say. But as for social innovation, I think the European Commission can at least take care that social innovation in, for, and by education is more considered in their next framework program. So let's see what's happening when this platform is opened. I believe it will be done very soon. Okay, then the next question, can I see those in the chat? That was Attila's on what.
Should I remind them to you then?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so the Attila's question was, what can the education system achieve on its own to tackle inequalities?
Okay.
I guess it should be whether you take this into consideration in your study rather than having a kind of a, you know, comprehensive and complete answer right now.
Yeah. There are actually already examples how education systems, or maybe let's say education institutions. I think it has to come from the bottom. That is also a major challenge, that education systems have to start a process in their own organization, each school or each education, to consider maybe a more open approach, and how can they be more social or more responsive to social needs, and how can they reach out for their social, for their environment and community in which they are in. Are they open to accept questions or problems that the community is bringing to them and asking for solutions, for example? And of course, how much can an individual do depends always on the directorates or on the chiefs of these organizations. I think this is definitely a start. It is not only from policy making where social innovation and where transformative moments start. It is very much from the bottom.
That's
okay.
And I think we'll have
next question.
Okay, so the next one could be, like, you know, very short. Could the introduction of social innovation policies that are rather instrumentalist, based on mechanistic ideas, you know, that it solves problems and is inherently good, could they hollow out education systems and the role of social science and humanities, do you think? And if you can consider also the other question, which was any ideas about how to deal with conflicts in the process of becoming more socially activist in education? Whether this have been addressed.
I think those are very difficult questions, because I'm not an educator. But you might probably find more more answers to these questions in the other studies that were commissioned. But personally, I don't believe that there is a hollowing out. But it would first require, of course, a change of curricula to have the focus and also the resources to take care of other topics, and not only the traditional topics of education in schools and universities, for example. So one focus can be, how can we learn to learn? How can we learn to identify social problems, and how can we learn to get in touch with people in need and with problematic communities? Okay.
Okay, so shall we move on then to Attila's paper? Attila, yeah, you can unmute. I think, you know, you deserve a couple of minutes anyway, just to tell us what your paper was about.
Thank you. Can you see my screen, please?
Yeah,
I cannot.
that's fine.
Okay. So thanks for accepting our paper. Let me stress immediately that it's a joint paper. As far as I remember, only my name appears in the program, but it's a joint work with György Molnár. The motivation was that, as I felt a bit already today, social innovation is a widely used buzzword. It is assumed that all sorts of social problems can be solved with this, but there are lots of problems with the meaning of social innovation. Klaus has spent quite a bit of time on the first Susanna and then Klaus. that's already a big problem in our view. The other one is that although we have long-standing traditions in analyzing business innovations, apparently these two communities do not learn from each other. Sometimes I have an impression that there are some sort of hostility even. Hopefully I'm wrong in that respect. Anyway, we saw that crossing borders might be useful because it can prompt some mutual learning. So this is our main motivation. And to do that, we are proposing a new definition of social innovation together with a new model, which is based on the multi-channel interactive learning model originally developed for analyzing business innovations. So this is the outline of the paper, what you have received. As I briefly mentioned, we are not really satisfied with most of the social innovation definitions. Of course, we don't know all of them because there are perhaps over 100, or so, I think some authors even claim that there are over 200 of social innovation definitions. So clearly we cannot be aware of all of those, but in most cases a positive impact is taken for granted in these definitions. We know one exception, that's the SI drive. In our view, impact must not be part of the definition. It should be assessed ex post once, or it can be, of course, a midterm one, either when a social innovation process is still going on or when it is completed. There is a lack of clarity concerning the unit of analysis, level of analysis in various definitions, but I don't go into those to those details. We provided probably the shortest definition of social innovation, namely, these are novel solutions or novel combinations of known solutions aimed at tackling a societal problem or creating a new societal opportunity. Given the discussion what we had so far, I'm really looking forward to your comments on our proposal. As I mentioned, our new model has been inspired by the multi-channel interactive learning model developed for business innovations by Carassa, Lundvall, and Mendoza. They put into the center the various types of activities, certain interfaces, types of knowledge, which are indispensable for business innovations, and also the micro and macro environment. We saw that it is a good starting point because in social innovations, you also see lots of different types of actors who generate and exploit a wide variety of knowledge for various purposes. That's why we saw that it's a good starting point. So this is our version, but instead of innovation activities, we put the actors into this circle, and in the central circle, we put not the type of activities which have been identified here, but the societal problem itself. And we think that social innovation practitioners and social innovators play a role not only in being involved in social innovation, but also as interfaces. They rely on a very broad set of knowledge. We didn't even want to mention on this graph. And of course, the micro and macro environment is important as well. And as we include social opportunities, not only societal problems, so it should be here as well. And then this group would be the potential beneficiaries of new societal opportunities. These are the main elements of the micro and macro environment. The outcome in our case are not innovations, but either an alleviated or solved societal problem. We believe that not only innovations which are social in terms of their means and ends, but other innovations might be also very important for tackling a social problem or creating a new opportunity. So this is what probably new in the literature. We have considered the various types of interactions among the actors, also the types of knowledge generated, exchanged, and utilized. And this is, so we are using 3 cases to illustrate our definition, the usefulness of our definition and model. This is one part of one of the illustrations where we try to identify who is learning from whom and what. Of course, I don't go into details. So as I said, we saw that it would be important to reconsider the widely used dichotomy of social versus technological innovation in our analytical efforts. It would be better to replace it by a different dichotomy, namely social versus business innovation, because they have different purposes. Obviously, business innovations try to improve the performance of a profit-oriented organization. I haven't mentioned that, of course, there are hybrid innovations as well, but in the discussion, perhaps we can tackle that one. And in our view, technological, organizational, marketing, financial, and so on and so forth, managerial innovations are introduced both for serving business innovation processes and in some cases, not in all cases, but in certain cases, for social innovation processes as well. So this is our definition, an over solution. It's an interactive learning process, and it's a co-evolutionary process of social innovation and required or parallel supportive business innovations and various other social innovations. We believe that this definition is relevant both for analysts as well as various practitioners, including policymakers. We believe that the stage models cannot be relevant.
Attila.
Sorry?
If you can wrap up, Attila, so that we have some time for comments. Yeah.
So just two more points. One is that we don't like the term scaling up because we believe that during the diffusion process and innovation, including social innovations as well, they are changing. They need to be not only adopted, but also adapted to the new context. And of course, we need to continue our work in various ways. The last point is that we were using the framework proposed by Beckert, who said that institutional social networks and cognitive frames are very decisive factors when we are trying to understand how markets operate. And that we thought it was a very useful framework for social innovations as well. And surprisingly, it is not really, the interactions among these factors are not really considered in business innovation studies, although the role of institutions and social networks are really emphasized. But the cognitive frames are usually not explicitly mentioned. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Attila. I will be brief, but of course we can extend the discussion and the commentary offline. My first reaction was that this is a very, very promising paper. I really liked, well, first of all, the approach that you have on trying to analyze social innovation through the multi-channel interactive learning. And I think that the multi-channel interactive learning has all the most important elements that the social innovation analysis should include. Although it seems to be primarily focused on learning, taken from the business innovation environment, but then of course we can adapt, and maybe the analysis of social innovation can go beyond the learning aspect. As you say, it can include types of activities and interactions and all that kind of elements. I also like the social grid approach from Beckert that you use throughout all the CRESI project I see. In terms of more specific comments like length of sections and stuff, and whether the document is fit for a paper, I can send them to you and we can discuss bilaterally. Another thing that I wanted to say is that, as Klaus, the first sections, I think it was 10 pages or so, it talks about all the different definitions and the normativity issue of social innovation and the distinction between social innovation and social change, the unit of analysis. But then the whole discussion, it doesn't really becomes obvious how it leads you to the new definition although the definition is something interesting, because especially the add-on of the opportunities alongside the challenges, I think the way that you led to yourselves to these definition is not obvious from the papers, from the paper itself, and I'm not sure that it needs such a big introduction, since you can also cross-reference from one paper to another, at least in the special issue that we are aiming for. Then the other major comment I have is that the three examples, they are not analyzed to the same level. So the CUTE program is much more analyzed, considering most of the elements of the suggested model, but then the two other examples are not that analyzed. So it seems like, you know, you either go very, very deep to one case that you very well illustrate how the model works on that, or you elaborate on all three cases to a lesser extent, but evenly, we can say. So these are my two major comments. The rest I will send you my notes, and we can you know, keep the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there is no need to reply. Your observations, two main observations, are absolutely correct.
Okay. Very good.
And also your assumption that we would like to develop into an article, that's also correct.
Okay.
All critical comments are really welcome.
Okay, I'll send them right away.
Okay, so we've got one question on the chat from Klaus. The bridge between research and social innovation is less strong than the bridge between research and economy. Do you have other empirical findings as you highlight this question quite prominently, this connection quite prominently?
Klaus, can you hear me? So can you elaborate on your question? I'm not sure if I have understood it correctly.
You showed in one of your first graphs very much that also the social innovation sector is influenced by the formal research sector. And I wonder, where do you have the empirical evidence for that? Because at least as far as my understanding is, this connection is quite a loose one, at least if you compare it to the business innovation sector, between this bridge between research sector and the business sector. Yeah, here it is. This knowledge needed for, I mean, there is knowledge needed, that's clear.
But let me stress that we are not talking about the research sector. We are talking about knowledge, which can be generated by various actors in various organizational setups. So in the original model, it is indeed the research sector.
Exactly.
But on purpose, we changed it into knowledge needed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe I can just, maybe I can have also a question about the role of universities and higher education institutes in this new model. Because if you talk about learning, if you talk about knowledge, I think they play a very important role. And it's a difference in their role with regard to the business innovation and with social innovation. It's a different ecosystem, it's a different role, a different partners which are important in these different aspects of innovation. Attila?
Yeah, a few years ago there was a session at the how is it called, Triple Helix. There is a relatively new, not that new, association called Triple Helix, and in Heidelberg there was an annual conference of Triple Helix, and there was a session on the role of universities, or more generally higher education, in social innovation, and there have been very interesting papers, and there are also, I think, Benevers and Cunha, they have already published, and so I think it would be unfair to pick just one or 2 points. So it is already a problem or an issue which have been studied by various authors, but from various angles. I think the higher education sector can play a very important role, either as a source of potential social innovation, the sector which is, using terrible economic language, the output of this sector is the potential social innovators on the one hand, so that's a sort of indirect role. But directly, universities from time to time are involved in actual social innovation processes. So I can't give you a short but comprehensive answer, but I think it's important. We have not studied it directly. In one of our cases, we have shown that that's the microcredit industry, that actually economists who were using randomized trial control to assess the impacts of the profit-oriented microcredit financial institutions on tackling easing poverty, whether it has had any positive impact, and apparently not. And there is already an impact, because although in some 10 years ago, huge funds were reallocated from sort of traditional methods and tools to try to alleviate poverty, though a very large chunk of those funds have been reallocated to the profit-oriented or non-profit-oriented microcredit industry. It has not worked, or definitely way below the expectations, very high expectations. And now there's a recognition among international development organizations, international aid agencies, that it's not the good, or definitely not as promising as it was thought 10, 15 years ago. So there is already impact of university research, but that's again, it's a sort of indirect impact. But what really matters is how they can analyze societal problems and how they interact with the various actors. So again, I can repeat, there is no short answer, but it's an important issue.
Thank you.
Okay, we got one more question, I think, from Bono. Hello. Okay, so I'll ask it. The idea of heterogeneous bundles of innovation I found interesting. Could it help us towards a vocabulary that takes dynamic / multi-dimensional nature of innovation seriously, away from all the conceptual SI to something less else, dichotomies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why this is our hope, that to provide a generic definition might be more promising than the sort of narrow one, when for instance the unit of analysis is at the level of macro structures. So we didn't want to constrain our investigations and other people who would be willing to use our definition and model. So that's why we saw that this generic, more general definition is more useful. And also there was a strong reason to stress the diversity in terms of the actors, in terms of their activities, in terms of their interactions, and also in terms of the type of knowledge, what they generate, disseminate, and utilize. So in one sentence, it was indeed our intention to account for the diversity and not to narrow down the understanding of social innovation to one or two types. I mean, definitely we don't want to narrow it down to only to social practices. So that's one difference compared to the SI drive definition, because I think more types of activities are important, not just those which can be labeled as social practices.
Okay, thank you. Thank you,
Could
Attila.
I briefly react to that?
Yeah. Yes, please do, Bono.
Yes, the general suggestion is just to show that empirically, and maybe the point that you want to make, maybe the whole exercise of going from the one definition to the other, maybe that is not the way to show this, because you stay in the loop of the conceptual and the definitions. I think you would have to show that in more empirical terms. Just a suggestion as regarding the form in which to transmit what you want to get across.
Okay, thank you.
In any case, interesting paper.
Obviously, we had very severe constraints in terms of, I mean, obviously we have not launched our own survey, but I think you are right that we should make some efforts to rely on existing surveys of actual social innovation activities, like the one produced by SI Drive. So that's a very rich source indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Attila. That was that is an interesting paper, and I hope you can develop it further in the light of the comments. So now we're going to move on to Dimitri, I believe.
Hello. Yes,
Hello, Dimi.
I believe it's my turn now. Let me share my screen, and I will be immediately with you.
Okay.
Okay, so I suppose you can now see the slides, right? Yeah. No.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Brilliant. So this presentation is based on a paper that we will be writing as an excerpt from this project that is ongoing for the last 2 years, New Technologies and Digitization, Opportunities and Challenges from for the Social Economy and Social Enterprises, sponsored by the Executive Agency for SMEs of the European Commission's co-authors Fotini and René. I think they're here as well. So, well, we're talking about the digital transformation, and that you know, it's involving all sectors of the economy, and it is important that the social economy keeps up with it. The idea is very simple. You know, digital technology as offer opportunities. So the social economy should take this into account in their own. Why it's not moving? Okay, so our idea is that the digital transformation is let's say should be somehow considered as a strategy for the social economy and the social enterprises. Although this strategy might affect each agent in a different way, it might be involving the internal organization of the social enterprise, may be at the interface between the social enterprise and the users or the beneficiaries, and it may be, let's say, involving the whole of the social economy organizations, in the sense that it becomes a digital social enterprises. These three stages, let's say, may be seen as not just as an interaction of how things may change or may involve a strategic approach to digitalization, but also different models of operations. And it's very important not to see these as, let's say, mutually exclusive sort of solutions. And these are, this is a view that takes into consideration how the technologies are seen. But we want to go a little bit further and relate the digitalization approach to, let's say, the way the companies function, the social enterprise function, rather than the way the technology affects or are integrated in the social enterprise. And in doing that, we see the social enterprise as a, let's say, as a little bit more complex sort of organization. We, on the one hand, we have a social mission, but on the other hand, we have, let's say, the need to be economically viable for a long time, and to have an impact on social and societal and environmental issues. That's, the three bottom lines usually attributed to this organization. And here, when we introduce these other aspects, we have the technology on one hand, we have the social aspects on the other hand, and we have the sustainability aspect on a third hand, if you wish. Then we have tensions emerging between balancing social and financial objectives, divergent dynamics, belonging tensions, and and learning tensions. Are we talking about social impact? Are we talking about viability issues? So which one is more prevalent in carry out our strategy? So we put this technology aspect together with this bottom line approach. So what we are looking at here is how this technological aspect, this integration, may be consistent with the digitalization strategy and the digital transformation and the social economy. So methodologically, very easy. We have identified and interviewed 26 digitally enabled social economy initiatives at a different stage of their digital transformation in 4 countries. And rather than see these are, as I mentioned earlier, as a mutually exclusive aspects, we look at a different spectrum of technological, economic, and social economy profiles. So these are the countries and why we selected them. Small and large countries with low and high digital economy and society index in 2009. And the findings, well, we saw that digital social economy startups do tend to operate on digital platforms and advanced digital technologies through a way of, let's say, presenting or introducing innovative social value propositions. When transferring this idea to a fully digital social economy enterprise, which operates entirely through these platforms, we can see that somehow, let's say 100% digitalization may not always be an optimal option, right? So it is important that some aspects are kept at arm's length and not disintermediated through digital technologies. And this is even more important in those areas where there is poor digital infrastructures or there is limited access to this infrastructure by part of the beneficiaries or the users, whereby we would need more face-to-face interaction. Nonetheless, even in those cases, there is huge margin for implementing quite advanced digital strategies within these organizations. So, considering long-term business sustainability, business model innovation, it is a challenge. It is a challenge, but when we see that these challenges are taken together with the technological aspects, we could see a spike in the creation of social value. And this creation of social values, in the words of our of the people we interviewed in our fieldwork, they are taken together and as being effective in addressing the social challenge and in, let's say, make sure that the organization may continue its existence in an effective and in efficient way. So we talk about technological appropriateness, right, as a critical element. So we have a few, because this work is policy oriented, we do have a few take-home messages looking at, you know, how this digital strategy for the social economy would look at ways to integrate different technologies. So that, let's say, technologies may be integrated within the workflow through efficiency-driven modernization, let's say, as a first step to digitize some of the analog operations, such as, I don't know, accounting, logistics, that sort of things. And then we may see how there might be some integration of services to capitalize on the various complementarities that digital technology might offer. And then we may talk of, you know, making these companies somehow modern, ready for the digital age. It's quite easier to think about this in terms of social startups. In fact, you know, when you are starting operation from scratch, then you might be able to implement think digitally first sort of, let's say, mindset. And to translate these aspects into a a policy sort of framework, we have selected these 5 important points that summarize what we've found. And when we translate that for the policymaker, we look at how these may be translated into more practical, let's say, well, recommendation basically into why and how to digitalize and what to look for while implementing digital technologies. So the integration of new and advanced technologies with digital platform or upon digital platforms. I think this was last slide because, well, you know, time is what it is. So I would basically pass the baton to the discussants.
Doris, yeah. Hi. Okay, so that would be Doris. Are you with us, Doris?
No, Doris is not here. This is Susanne again.
Hi, Susanne.
We did this together, but the main credits are actually for Doris.
Okay.
And
I'm taking notes. Thank you.
We have prepared 3 slides. Can I show them? Do I still have the right to share my screen?
Yeah, you have to select share to share your screen. You're still co-host.
Should be able to, Susanne.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
Okay. I just have to minimize this. Okay. So we found that the a research topic and the research question is very interesting and does not seem to be explored so much before this contribution. So how does digital technology impact on social economy enterprises is a very important question for the present and for the future. And where does ICT foster social service delivery, and how does this affect different levels? And especially, what are the hurdles in capitalizing on ICT in terms of social economy enterprises? We think this is definitely worth further exploration, hopefully a scientific paper. So the methodology was just explained in Dimi's slides right now. We did our comments based only on the slides and the abstracts. So as he pointed out, there is no paper, and in our scanning of the slides, we were not sure if this was an integrated study or if there were actually 3 different studies, because we were not able to connect the prospective study that you pointed out in your talk to the interviews and to the policy creation workshop. So having a little bit more knowledge who the participants were, or who they represented, what their background was, and if they were the same people always or different, that would be really interesting for us, especially for the policy co-creation workshop. The prospective study sounds a little bit like a foresight approach. We were not sure if this is true. So our first impression was that the research presentation needs a bit more coherence, and findings would need a bit more depth and linkage to concept and methodology, as these the empirical findings and methodology, and also the policy implications stand a little bit next to each other, but we were not sure where the connection is. So on the theoretical background, I must admit I'm really absolutely no expert on this. So this is what Doris suggested. That the concept of operand and operand is probably very useful, but not clear how this impacted the research design. At least we could not see this from the slides. And there are older papers that probably have laid the ground for Akaka and Vargo already. And these were published by Burroughs already in 86 and 1990. So maybe it's worth to look into those as the foundations of the theory of innovation in services and the differentiation. So in the abstract, also there seem to be interesting conceptual issues around different levels of the social economy and the notions of efficiency and effectiveness. And we think these should be more explored, but could not find enough to satisfy our cravings for more knowledge on this. And in the abstract, you suggest also that there's a social vision and mission of the social economy, but this sounds rather global. So does this really exist? Or maybe can you differentiate this more to the businesses that you actually researched? And in terms of the findings and policy, these are on a rather abstract level. So maybe you can take care that the reader does not get the impression that they are trivial. So we suggest to use more examples as you come to your conclusions, and because more examples would help to liven up the results and make them more original. And some other important issues we would like to know more about is, for example, if face-to-face is more important for social enterprises than in other sectors. And does ICT actually help? Or what subgroups in the population can still be helped because they are more attached to information technologies? So in conclusion, we would say that the relation of the theoretical concepts to the finding and policy implication is a bit fuzzy. And what I would also like to add is that the countries you picked are quite interesting, and also your reasoning for this. But what about the findings of your empirical study? Can you actually make differentiations there according to the country origin of the companies? And are there maybe also different types of social enterprises dependent on the countries or independent? Okay, this is what I have for now.
Okay. Well,
okay. Just to let you know that we're 5 minutes late, and Demi, if you can be as short as possible. I see one comment from the chat, but this has already been been picked up by Suzanne, which is to include more examples. So if you can be as short as possible, just to allow also a 5 minutes break to stretch our legs.
Okay, so right, can you still hear me? Yes. So very simply, yes, I do take this comment on board, and thank you very much, because they're extremely useful. And in fact, if I can have the slides, they will be very useful. And also regarding technologies and examples of appropriate technologies, we have several discussions in the report about technology appropriateness. But to give an idea is, yes, we can have a fully integrated, digitalized, as we do, social enterprise, but that deals with relieving loneliness for old and frail people. Well, how does translate in terms of, let's say, interface with the beneficiaries? Well, it cannot through technology, but technology can be used within the companies, and then people are interfacing individually with the beneficiaries. And these are the aspects that are specific to how social economy enterprises are organizing themselves in order to benefit for the digital transformation and to be able to carry out their social service remit. So altogether, we do have these examples. It is a question of reducing our, 200-page, 150-page report into something that is manageable and understandable in terms of a journal paper. And we are at the beginning, and this has been our first cut, if you want. We will take great advantage of the suggestion given. Well, thank you so much.
Effie.
Yeah, okay. I think that we're okay for taking a 5 minutes break, stretching our legs and getting back with Alina.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, guys.
Okay. Shall we leave it like this? Open like this, or
yeah, you stay on.
Okay.
Yeah, you keep on being
Look at ethnicities, whether we look at historical regions, whether we look at administrative regions. So what matters in this extent, and some papers look at national level, some at regional level, and it's all a bit mixed. And the case studies, especially which focus on the context, in my impression, they usually either take a couple of cases per city or per region, or they take a lot of cases per, for example, from a country, which I think blurs the understanding of the concept of the context, because I think it's good to have different perspectives of how different social innovations, for example, in a region see the role of the context where they operate. And also, another observation that I've got is that in the geography of social innovations, I think it's quite common to apply methods and the frameworks and variables, for example, that exist in business innovation research. And my research is I also follow this kind of trend by using the concept of proximity, which is a concept which mainly used in the research of business innovation. So the question is, how does proximity influence social innovation process? This is a general question that I'm asking in my research. So before I look at the proximity and social innovations, I just wanted to give you a brief, introduction or example of how this concept is used in business innovation research. So traditionally, it has been looked at as geographical distance between the actors. So the actors which are co-located, they can benefit from each other. And that was especially seen in the context of knowledge and tacit knowledge, because the ability of firms to absorb it and to identify it is a critical capability which defines the innovation process in firms. So being co-located with other firms, you can benefit and get the knowledge spillovers from them. However, a small example, for example, if we have different firms which are located in a little Happyville, they all exchange knowledge and they all benefit from each other, and thus they're all innovative and better off. And while this little company, he or she doesn't have access to this knowledge spillovers which circulate in Happyville. However, many researchers also noted then that not only
being close to someone influences the process of knowledge and learning and interaction, but also shared norms and values, shared industries of operation or technologies used, and also being in the same framework or being or having a trusted relationships. And also some researchers said that you don't have to be constantly collocated with someone, and you can experience temporary collocation to benefit. And so proximity is thus understood as being close in many terms, including geographical, to benefit from knowledge and learning and interaction. Okay. So coming back to our small example, just you can see that you don't have to be in Happyville to communicate with other companies or actors, and you can still share knowledge and you still can benefit from this interaction. So I don't want to focus too much on this, but I have found, I think, two prominent versions of typology of different geographical and non-geographical proximity. So some researchers distinguish more types. For example, in Ron's paper, he spoke about 5 types of proximities, which is cognitive, it's proximity in knowledge bases of companies. Geographical, which is the instance. Organizational, it's the governance relation between the firms. Social, which is micro-level relations such as trust. And institutional, which is macro-level relations, which is like norms and values. And other authors say, for example, in this paper of Nobben and Orley-Mans, they argued that organizational proximity incorporates social and institutional. And they also spoke about technological, which is kind of similar to cognitive, and geographical. So important to know about proximities is that they can strengthen each other. So, for example, absence of geographical closeness can be strengthened by closeness in social terms, so institutional terms, that too much or too little proximity harms, so it's good to maintain balance. And also the dynamics matter. So, for example, some companies choose to relocate to certain areas to benefit from being close to certain clusters. Okay, so that was a little introduction on the proximity, and now we look at social innovations. And if we want to apply the concept of proximity to social innovations, I think it's important to understand whether knowledge sharing and knowledge creation plays the same role if we look at innovation, social innovations and proximity. So the question here is whether the specially created knowledge defines the territorial nature of social innovations. And I think the answer is probably not, because, well, in the literature, if you look at the role of the knowledge, it's kind of, again, blurry, because it is acknowledged as an input of social innovations and as an output of social innovations, but it's not a determinant of social innovators who wants to locate in a certain area. And knowledge is rarely distinguished between tacit and codified, as many researchers just speak about knowledge role, but I think it's not really addressed in great details in the literature. However, so the knowledge is not, I think, an important determinant of concentration of social innovators, but still social innovations are called territorial processes. And a prominent important contribution here in this kind of territorial models of social innovations is by papers authored or co-authored by Frank Moller. I hope I pronounced it correctly. So the general logic here is that for a long time we have focused on technological innovation-led growth in local areas, which led to exclusion and to social inequalities. But then there is an idea that local areas, they need local solutions, local institutions. And thus the social innovations could be these instruments which will help to regenerate these local areas and bring equality and empower society. So neighborhoods in this case are seen as the arenas of social innovations, meaning that they provide local context in history and established rules and practices, and they provide local actors which engage in social innovation process and tackle local needs. So while this approach in this contribution is, I think, very prominent, there are a number of questions which I have to this model and to this view. First is there is lack of coherence in defining or using local areas. So there are, like, if you look at the papers of Mollert and similar papers which which adopt his view, they use very different scales. First of all, they use city, region, as part of cities, sometimes several regions, and the terms differ. So from neighborhoods to local areas and so they're almost never defined. How local is local? So is it a part of a city or is it several neighborhoods? And how big is a neighborhood? So this is not really clear. Also not really clear in this perspective is how dynamics of communities influence it. For example, migration and when new people come in communities or when people move out, how this influences the local norms and how, again, these local norms and changes in them influence social innovations. So the main question is, geographical co-location really enough for people to share norms and values and history? And interestingly, there is another approach, which is also, you could find it in works of Mollert. In this paper, 2005, they talk about social region, and here in the paper, they use a term of communities, which are defined in a broader terms. So they're not defined as geographical communities, but communities that can be based on different sorts of social relation, based on ethnicity, based on profession, based on organization. And the social innovation is a process of regenerating different types of capital, which are also complementary. So you can see that this approach is similar to the approach of proximity research in business innovation, especially the complementarity of capital and the broader definition of communities. However, in many, in this paper, which I put on the slide, and many other papers, they still come back to the territorial communities. So the overall picture is a bit unclear. In many other papers, which are also case studies, so which don't focus explicitly on the context, but they can also give us some, insight about the role of the context. So it's my schematic representation. I think many authors speak about trust and how it's important either for service delivery and for partnerships, which are in turn critical for resources for social innovations, including knowledge, but also not knowledge necessarily, also some other resources like power or money. There is lack of understanding of how knowledge of the partners on knowledge, different experiences influences partnerships of social innovations. It's also lack of knowledge of how governance and organizational structures influences it. And geographical proximity, as I said, it's not clear whether it can be the foundation of trust and shared values. So adapting the proximity terms, so it's the same picture, but I just put different terms to it. We can see that it's kind of blurry. So there is some evidence that social and institutional proximity is important for users and also for partners. So we can distinguish two different levels. There is lack of information about organizational proximity and cognitive proximity. And geographical proximity is believed to have a strong influence, but I question it. This is a preliminary findings, which I'm going to demonstrate you, because it's an ongoing research, but I can comment on some key findings of the analysis. So first of all, I used Ron Boschma's proximity typology. I combined social and institutional proximity together because in many other papers on social innovations, and including Mollert's research, he spoke that social capital and institutional capital should be treated as the same entity for social innovations. So I used 4 types of proximities. I focused in 5 metropolitan areas in different countries. I'm not going to talk about how I chose them, but just quickly, I wanted to have different conditions for social innovation capabilities, like in how strong is the business environment in the city, and also the level of social problems. So all these cities have different combinations. So some are more developed, some are less developed. And I based this research on interviews with social innovators and informants from different organizations. Okay, so I wanted to briefly comment on the role of the context. So going back to my previous point about different contexts, different scales, most of the projects, they didn't operate in neighborhood, they operated in cities, meaning that they delivered services to people in cities, but the scale of partnerships differed. So they, most of them also engaged in partnerships of different geographies, city, regional partners, national and international partners. Here it was sometimes difficult to judge because, for example, sometimes it was an international organization like Red Cross based in, for example, Stockholm. So in this case, they were treated as local partner or international partner, but I treated it as, I just put general international partners. Also, none of the social innovators moved to a certain city to start a project. So they didn't, they just used what's around them. And when they were asked whether it was absolutely critical to start in a certain city, most of them said no, because they said, this project would have been possible anywhere. However, some of them acknowledged that the partnerships enabled them to operate in different scales and to deliver impact to many more actors than it would be probably possible in different cities. What is critical, I think, is to establish social proximity, to establish it to partners and to users. It did not require collocation because most of them, it can require temporary collocation just for updates. But most of them, for example, they met like once in 3 months, or they spoke online. So it doesn't have to be from the same city. Social proximity to users does not have to be temporary either. They can, connect to them via online, like Twitter, social networks, and they can meet temporarily. But some, of course, they were based in communities, and also, so social proximity seems very crucial part of social innovation process. And whether they wanted to expand the services on different groups, social innovators had to establish social proximity to this new different group. Yes, it was an important factor. And so going back to my representation of literature, I changed direction of some errors. So I think that geographical proximity to users and to partners contributes to social proximity, but it does not require geographical proximity. So social and institutional proximity to users and partners is wider than just geographical. Again, it matters for partnerships and resources. Cognitive proximity, I think it's quite interesting because it's not necessarily similar cognitive knowledge bases, but it might be complementarity, which matters of different partnerships. And organizational proximity, I think, is quite not important, but I think it's kind of secondary in terms of influence. So looser structures and more flexibility allowed branches or allowed organizations to establish social institutional proximity and to adjust to different contexts.
Hey, Lena, I think we'll have to wrap up pretty much.
Yeah, so it's just my last slide. This one, and I'm finished. So I think there are just some questions and thoughts because this research is still ongoing. And I just keep thinking about whether there is like a right scale where we should look at social innovations, because it seems like different cases are more territorial than the others, and they are some more contextual, some are more broader, because many of them, they tackle universal problems, and they don't just tackle, of course they tackle like problems of homelessness, which is a universal problem. It might have specifics of being in a certain city, but you know, some problems they didn't have that much influence of the context. Yes, and I think that's it. Thank you.
Oh, very good, thank you. So I think do we have Ron here? I think for a response.
Okay,
yes, thank you, Alina. Okay, I was writing down a lot of stuff based on your presentation. It's very interesting work that you're working on. Of course, we met before in Utrecht, where you stayed for a while, and then I already thought that your work was already pretty creative and original. I'm not an expert on social innovation, as you know, so I'm not that familiar with the literature. So I might have some questions there based on your presentation, but I think overall, there's a lot of echo now.
No.
I can't hear myself. All right. Okay. Yeah, it's now gone. Okay, good. Yeah, so what I like about your approach is indeed that you look at, that you're very, very well aware of the fact that social innovation, and as you refer to it as business innovation, might not be the same, right? That you have to be careful to apply that innovation concept in business research, to apply that to the analysis of social innovation. So I think that is spot on. And then, of course, the big question is how do they differ, and to what extent might that have an impact on the outline of your research? I think that is a crucial question that you also address in this paper. And then I think the second part is interesting in the sense that you apply the proximity framework and see to what extent that also makes sense to apply it to the concept of social innovation. So indeed, I think that is very good to make that very explicit, and in that sense, I like it also a lot. Okay, a bit of questions because I did not have a paper or presentation before, so I just have to come up a bit with questions based on your presentation. I think you were the question that that triggered me during your presentation is again what is social innovation, right? I'm sorry, maybe you already discussed this at length during previous sessions during this meeting, but I was not part of that service. But you didn't give a definition, right? So I would really like to know also, because you're looking at 27 different social innovation projects, you refer to it as, right? But they might not all be the same. So that might also affect your results, and to what extent a different type of proximities step in. I think you were referring to that a bit in your last slide. So maybe you could tell a bit about that. What type of social innovation projects, and whether you see also remarkable outcomes in that respect. Maybe you can even categorize types of social innovation and see to what extent they score the same in terms of the proximities that you have identified and addressed in your empirical design. My second question would be a bit more about the conceptual framework and also the work of Frank Moulaert that you addressed in your framework. I'm not sure whether I entirely understood when you were saying when you were developing this interesting question about to what extent knowledge sharing is also part of social innovation processes, right? Because in business innovation, as you say rightly, has become one of the most critical issues that have been taken up in research. But when you apply to social innovation, you mentioned just that knowledge is both an input and an output. And I'm not entirely sure, well, maybe you need to clarify that a bit more, because that would mean it's a bit different type of approach than for business innovation, where other people have applied it. Then I think when you were, well, still it's work in progress, as you mentioned, so I'm sure you will think about that a lot, is when it is about making connections, right? And you seem to refer to two different type of agents, right? It's users and partners. Those are the two you mentioned again and again and again. I think you have to be a bit more explicit here. Right, so actually also in the empirical work, what do you actually mean by users? Who are that? And that might, again, differ from project to project. There might be different users, the same with partners. I think here, of course, the proximity dimension step in, because then, yeah, when you talk about proximity, it's always a dyadic thing which connects two agents or two organizations, however they are defined, and then it becomes indeed interesting to see to what extent proximities are important or not. So I think you should maybe clarify a bit more about users and partners, what they really mean in your research. And whether you would also maybe expect different outcomes in terms of the relative importance of the different proximities between those two types of agents. I think that it could be worthwhile to explore a bit more in detail. Then about you analyzed 5 metropolitan areas. Of course, my question would be why those, but you already said, well, maybe we should not go too much into that, but still it might be important because when you talk about institutional and proximity, it might be the case that those metropolitan areas do have a specific context in different metropolitan areas. So you actually compare two very well. I can't exactly recall in which countries they were all located, but for sure in the Netherlands and in the UK. Well, the institutional context is very different because the national institutions are very different and things like that. So to what extent have you also looked into that? To what extent you also find remarkable differences between countries in that respect?
Okay, Ron. I think Ron, we might have to stop it there just for now.
Okay.
Timing. But thank you. They were really good comments, I think, for Alina to consider. We've just got one question, Alina, in the chat. And again, it relates a little bit to Ron's last point about the different country contexts. So Ed is asking whether all your cases were open membership, and he's drawing our attention to the fact that in the UK, urban food relief, for example, is often organised separately by different faith communities, even if they provide relief to all the people organising it, maybe from different communities. But maybe that's something for you to reflect on.
Yeah, thank you, Ron, for your comments. It's a lot of feedback, and I will definitely think about all this. And about the questions, I would say they were all open membership because they're all free to join. So there are, of course, people who run it and who would join it. They belong to different communities. For example, the open data kind of social innovations, they would attract people interested in open data, and social innovations which target homeless people, they would attract people compassionate to this kind of questions. But so they were open, but in different ways. People belong to different kind of communities. So I hope it answers your question, Ed, if that's what you meant. Do you have to reflect? Do you have time to reflect to Ron's comments or not? Oh, I can't hear. Kate.
Hello, Kate.
Hello.
Yes, you're there.
So yeah,
Yes,
Alina, you're going to just quickly respond to something, and then we'll move on.
Yes, and there's also a question: how did I identify social innovations in empirical terms? So the definition, I used the definition of Phil's from 2008 paper, that social innovations are, I can't quote it now, but it's that I think it's social. They are solutions to social problems which are more sustainable, just than existing solutions that deliver a value to public rather than private individuals. So, and then I did not restrict myself into certain social innovations from that are social enterprises or, for example, grassroots groups. So I tried to focus on broader scale, and so the purpose of it was to see whether social innovations which are different in organizational forms, whether they would also differ in how they reflect the proximity and how they, how they interact with the contexts. And I just Googled and I tried to ask people whether they can point me towards, different projects in their cities, and that's how I found them. So
good. I think that that answers also Bono's question in the chat. So, well, he's asking more about how you identify them, but I guess we could leave it there.
Actually, not really.
Yeah.
Just wanting to point out that that definition left me with a lot of confusion. Like if I would go to Stockholm with that definition in my hand, I would be in big troubles finding a social innovation or judging whether something counts as a social innovation or not, which in turn would leave me very much in the dark to figure out proximity, because I wouldn't know proximity to what. So probably intuitively you have developed a definition that is much more concrete, but the one that you're using there on paper probably is not really helpful to the analysis that you want to make. But I'll mute myself, sorry. Thank you for a nice presentation.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so Olu's put a definition in the chat from 2008 as well, so we could have a look at that afterwards. So I guess it's probably time to move on to the final presentation, which is from Olu Ogonfuora.